honored to be up here, and really in this wonderful panel. All three of them are actually close friends of mine, so that's double honor. And I want to introduce them because they have been introduced before, with the exception of Rudy. Rudy Theise, very briefly, he can say more about himself, but he's the Joseph and Ethel Kennedy endowed professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School, and he's also the director or vice director of vice chair. It doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Just titles. But Massachusetts General Hospital. But he really is doing primary research in particularly Alzheimer's, and he'll tell us more about it. His talk is coming up at 5 o'clock, I believe. So we'll do this panel in open fashion, sort of enjoying ourselves. This is one of the primary laws of consciousness is enjoyment. And I would like to, in order to have time to interact with you, the audience, because you're also a participant here in the panel, in order to honor you and to give you time, I would like to ask each participant on the panel to give us 5 to 7 minutes or so of your own views of entanglement in your own research, or if you don't want about your own research, perhaps some issue that is particularly intriguing to you or open issue of entanglement in your field of studies. So we'll start with Federico, and after we finish this first round, then we'll have a few minutes, each one of us, to interact with each other. Maybe if no interaction is needed, maybe say a few more words about what we just said. And then we'll open up to Q&A with the audience. Federico, could you go first?
Right. Can you hear me? Is it on? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, entanglement from the point of view of physics is actually well defined. Basically, there are two or more particles that have a joint property, a common property. But the implications of entanglement are the ones that are baffling, because they would imply that space and time doesn't exist for the particles that are entangled. And in fact, the very nature of space and time is highlighted, in a sense, the strange nature of space-time is highlighted by the existence of entanglement. The fact that you can have the distance doesn't matter when you make a measurement in one particle and the other immediately, instantaneously take the value that was entangled with the first. So in the perspective that I have, however, where consciousness is primary, if we take that perspective, then consciousness exists in a domain where there is no space and time. So, so the non-locality, which is the consequence of entanglement, the fact that it doesn't appear to be space and time, is already a property of the domain in which consciousness exists. So it is sort of a natural property there. And so to me, then entanglement, the fact that we have entanglement in the quantum system is a little bit like the tip of the iceberg of a theory that purports consciousness to be primary, where some of the reality of consciousness intrudes into our four-dimensional world, space-time world. Because in a sense, in this theory, space, time, and matter have to be created within consciousness. That energy that I mentioned earlier that is dynamic and aware is all there is. And everything that arises from that energy, everything that exists arises from that energy. And so it's made of that energy, so is conscious. So an electron is conscious. So there was before a question about, where do you have the first collapse of the wave function? Well, if all the particles if consciousness already exists, permeates everything that exists, well then, and if we assume that consciousness, if we take the position that consciousness is the one that collapses the wave function, well then you don't have to wait for the first cells to emerge for the collapse of the wave function to occur. It can occur right from the beginning. It is an inherent property of what everything is made of. So to me that position resolves a lot of questions that we have, brings in purpose, meaning, which are thrown out of the window in a pure mechanistic and materialistic theory that denies that there is any interiority, any free will, anything. It's true that, like Henry explained before, that there is free choice within, to some extent. There is free choice to some extent within quantum physics, but it doesn't go far enough, as far as I'm concerned. And the emergence of order out of free choice is one of the major problems that will have to be solved by mathematical theory of consciousness, which hopefully will appear at some point. So my view on the subject is that when we will have a mathematical theory of consciousness, then many of the questions that we have, many of the apparent paradoxes that we have will be resolved. But not only that, but we will be able to go a step further in the union of science and spirituality, the union of inner and outer reality, because we have now a monistic theory where consciousness is primary, instead of a monistic theory which we have now by default in physics, where the material world is primary, matter is primary.
Thank you, Federico. Henry, you're next.
Well, entanglement, of course, excuse me, is a property of quantum mechanics, and as such, there's no mystery about it. The mystery comes because our thinking is so heavily influenced by ideas coming from classical mechanics. And if you try to think of the quantum procedure that's going on in quantum mechanics from a perspective of classical mechanics, then there's a mystery. But within quantum mechanics itself, quantum mechanics is a completely rational understanding, and entanglement is a rationally coherent part of the theory. So, in effect, I think there's no mystery, and it's a misunderstanding to think that there's something mysterious about entanglement. If you just look at it, if you accept, since it's a part of quantum mechanics, and let's just say we accept orthodox quantum theory as the premise, and then we do find that if we have one of these entangled systems where you have somehow a source of two particles and they fly out to different regions, you do find that the choice of what to observe over here, a choice made over here, affects the reality over there. Now, even in classical mechanics, it's a little bit like this two billiard ball situation. Suppose we have a situation where you have two billiard balls, one black and one white, and you send one of them off to this region and one of them off to this region. And if the observer over here, in the first place, if he sees a white ball here, he will know that there's a black ball over there. And there's nothing mysterious about that. There's no instantaneous communication. It's just a fact that we have these two parts of nature, and they're correlated. And you find out something about one, you immediately know something about the other. In quantum mechanics, it's a little more complicated because you don't just have these material balls. What you have is something that's not material. you have these potentialities. You have the various potentialities for, and what are these potentialities? These potentialities are potentialities for experiences to occur. And so in the case that we're talking about here, an observer on one side asks the question, do I see a white ball? And so he poses a question. Nature responds yes or no. And that since the state of the universe is not a material thing, but it's a system of potentialities and possibilities, once you've reduced the possibilities in a certain way, you're going to get this collapse of the system, and it's a part of the quantum mechanical solution. And within that theory, there's no mystery. Since the thing you're talking about, the state of the universe, is a set of possibilities and potentialities, once you reduce the set of potentialities to a subsystem, then since the potentialities themselves are correlated, once you decide that this is what happens here, what happens on the other side is so. And it's not, as you will so often hear, somehow a collapse of the two different points to the same point, or some mysterious thing like that. In orthodox quantum theory, the whole structure is based on the idea that you have a space-time structure. Let's not go to relativistic, to gravity theory, but just ordinary gravity-free theory. You have a rigid space-time structure, like I was showing on the board this morning. You have properties assigned to these points. There's never any coming together and some mixing up of the two different regions. They are in their respective places. The correlation that occurs has to do with not a collapse of space-time or a failure of space-time, but the fact that the reality that's embedded in space-time has a correlation. It's a correlation of possibilities. It's not a correlation of material things. It's a correlation of possibilities for things to happen if you make observations. So once you look at it from that point of view, since the whole thing was a collection of possibilities, and you've now reduced the possibilities, and the possibilities are correlated, it's not a mysterious feature of the theory. It looks mysterious if you do not resist the temptation to try to understand it from a classical point of view. From a classical point of view, if you think that the state is really a state of matter, then of course you're going to. So it seems to me that the point of this is that you've got to shift your thinking to a quantum mechanical point of view, and get rid of it with great effort. Usually, this tendency for classical way of thinking to impinge upon your thinking, and this classical way of classical mechanics, you see, even defines what science is. From a classical point of view, science is just about the material part of nature. You leave consciousness out. So the whole idea of what consciousness, of what science is supposed to deal with the physical. Whereas you shift over to quantum theory, and the first premise is that no, the reality is not the physical, the reality is the mental aspect of it. The mystery disappears, because the mystery that you're talking about is trying to think of it as if this state of the universe is somehow has to do with the material part rather than the mental part. And so my message is that it's just a question of teaching yourself how to think about these things in terms of the idea, pushing aside the classical biases, the quantum mechanical, the classical biases, and trying to think in the way that quantum mechanics requires.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Well, Rudy, you are in the enviable position or situation of being a neurologist among a bunch of physicists.
Which one of these is not like the other?
Right. So tell us from your perspective.
Well, so my role here is to talk about neuroscience and entanglement as part of neuroscience. And I think, picking up on what Federico and Henry just said, I think the theme here is also a classical viewpoint is getting in the way of solving mysteries in neuroscience that may have a quantum solution. So starting with the biggest mystery, where are memories stored? When you recall a certain feeling, a very subtle feeling, the night of your first prom, or you recall right now your mother's face in your mind. How is that stored? Where are those data? Neuroscience, as I studied it as a student, teaches us how events are recorded in synapses, correlated to be associated with each other and maintained, and then recalled. And in Alzheimer's disease, you lose the ability to record and, to some extent, recall. But those memories presumably might be somewhere. Well, where are they? Are they encoded in the brain and somehow, and if you take the physical point of view, just in protein, fat, and water? Or is there something else we don't understand about the brain that could be explained by a more quantum approach? So the second mystery that relates to that is gamma. When you look at gamma waves in the brain, or the EEG state of gamma state, there's an amazing amount of synchrony in the brain, or what we call phase lock, where certain areas of the brain will be turned on at exactly the same time. And there's not enough time to say there's neurotransmission of them talking to each other. There's a synchrony of regions being turned on, especially in gamma. And, we don't understand how that happens. We will someday. But what it says is that a classical explanation of cause and effect cannot explain how to synchronized activation of various brain regions and connectivity. And when you think about consciousness, attention, having awareness isn't just enough. Awareness has to have attention for consciousness. When you're under anesthesia, awareness is in there, but you don't have attention, so you're unconscious. But in that state, your brain is still active. What is not happening is connectivity. Regions are not talking to each other. And what I'm saying is that there are events of awareness, of consciousness in the brain, where it is synchronistically turning on different brain regions exactly at the same time, which we can't explain with classical physics. This then gets to the third mystery, and this is you may know of an experiment that Persinger did in Toronto back in, I think it was 2008. Took 8 people who didn't know each other and paired them up. So you had 4 pairs of 2. And basically, once a week, I think it was twice a week for 1 hour, twice a week for 4 weeks, the 2 people had to just be near each other within 2 meters. They didn't have to speak. They could speak if they want. They just had to be in proximity of each other within 2 meters, twice a week for 1 hour for 4 weeks. Then later, he took these pairs, and then one of them had magnetic stimulation of the cortex, and the other one was being recorded by EEG. And what you would see is an unusual predominance of gamma, delta, and some low alpha waves in the person on the receiving end, but not the others who weren't paired up with that person. And then those who are on the receiving end reported strange emotions ranging from anxiety and anger to sexual arousal. I guess it depended on who they were paired up with, if they were upset with them or they wanted them. But this was, we don't know how to explain something like this with classical neuroscience. And all 3 of these mysteries may be related, and maybe someday, following up on the great work that you 3 do, we'll understand how quantum mechanics may explain some of these mysteries.
Great. So what, to me, emerges from this discussion, active discussion, creative discussion, is that the issue we're addressing here, I think all of you in a way brought it up, is that it's a much bigger problem or a much bigger issue than just the interpretation of quantum theory. We know that there's at least 20, 25 interpretations of quantum theory. But here we're actually also talking about the way science, and this has actually interested me a lot. That's why actually I was very I was pushing for Rudy to be in the panel, because the implications are not just for physics, and I think all of us are saying that it's not physics, and as soon as you bring in the issue of consciousness as primary, it cannot be just physics. It's at least mental, it's at least psychological, it's at least brain science, but actually we're saying that it's much more than that, that a way of thinking that is sort of ossified in the scientists, which is, I find that even among physicists who will tell you, yes, quantum theory is the foundation of everything, then we go about, sometimes including myself, doing science as if science is classical in the sense of external objects, and the observer may be there, maybe not there. So it does raise actually very serious issues on both epistemology and the ontology of science. And I would add a third word to that, I don't know the Greek, not the Greek word, but they say as theology, or basically the feeling foundation of interactions, because feelings and qualia, as Federico told us, is also very, very important. They cannot be distinguished. So for this second part of our panel, I would like to give the opportunity to each one of you to comment on what we just heard from each other, or add a few more points to what you said. So I'll start now in reverse order. We're ready?
Well, I would ask the three of you, how would you imagine a brain region here, if physically distant from here? Now remember that in embryogenesis, these cells were together at some point. There was like that experiment with the 4 couples who didn't know each other. These cells were in proximity of each other for a long time during embryogenesis, and now they're, at some point, the brain's developing. At some point, there are hundreds of trillions of neurons, and then the brain has to get rid of most of those, and you end up with 100 billion winners, which is amazing to me. At some point, if we have over a trillion neurons, that's more than the synapses we have. Well, there's hundreds of trillions of synapses, there's just as many. So let's take these cells that have been in, let's say in proximity, let's say entangled, and now they've separated. Now you have brain regions that are somehow interacting and being activated at the same time in response to stimuli, but you cannot explain, there's no central master input that's coming into all of them at the same time. You can't see it when you do, connectivity and activation experiments. If you had to think of an explanation for how quantum mechanics might allow that to happen, and God knows I don't know, any ideas on how if you just had to, freely speculate on how that might happen?
Can I ask, you emphasized the point that originally they were close together and now they're far apart.
Yeah.
But is it true that you look at cells that were not once close together but are now far apart, that you don't get the same sort of effect?
Well, yeah, I guess the devil's in the detail there. That originally you have some stem cells that are in close proximity, but then as they migrate and start to differentiate, you may have new rounds of proliferation where new cells are born. So I guess from a division point of view, they all came from the same stem cells, but they didn't have to all be in the same proximity to each other.
Okay. So you can't do an experiment that would actually distinguish the situation where they're close together.
Well, you could map it out. You could map out which ones were close together and which ones weren't during development.
You could do. See whether there's a bigger effect when they were closer together at the beginning at the stem cell.
You mean like a distance effect?
From ones that were kind of the opposite side and weren't so close together, you have still as big an effect. So is it the closeness at one point that's responsible or that's correlated? I think that would be an interesting thing to say, because I would maybe suggest that the closeness at the beginning isn't really the essential.
Right. I made that up. I just said they're close together. I'm just wondering, because of proximity, if that matters. So, but I didn't make up that they were close together, but I just made up the idea that maybe that mattered. But I'm just asking, the main question is during gamma synchrony, when different brain regions can all be turned on exactly at the same time, at least within the limits of detection and technology we have. There's speculations that mind and consciousness in non-local existence is somehow coordinating a collapse locally into all these regions at once. So you haven't.
When you say they both come on together, do they both have the same frequency, or is it different frequencies they just turn on in some sense? Are you talking about
well,
the frequency?
It's activation, so they're being activated at the same time, and that the wave, the EEG wave associated with that co-activation is usually gamma.
Usually gamma, so it's the same frequency in two different...
Right, because it's a gamma wave that correlates with this co-activation of regions at the same time. But we don't really understand, this, which we call phase lock, is how that happens, because you don't have just one master neuron somewhere saying, all of you turn on at once, which leads to speculation among, those who might attend this meeting, that there may be a non-local controller and then a collapse into a local event at the same place at the same time.
All I can say is there's some very similar sort of things that are happening in Berkeley. A very renowned neuroscientist called Walter Freeman is doing some experiments up there that are not the same as these by any matter of means, but they do show the same sort of non-classically understandable correlations, that things are somehow starting at the same time and ending at the same time, and even in phase with each other. I mean, they both start, and even not only do they start going together, but the phase of the two is the same, which is another degree of freedom. And so I have been, thinking that's certainly a very rich thing to study, and but I haven't gotten any answers yet.
Well,
if you don't have them, I don't have them.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I actually never thought about that problem, but so in the spur of the moment, I can say the following, that perhaps if you consider that these cells are conscious and that somehow they are connected from the inside by their consciousness, maybe there is a path there to synchronize them. Or you can, maybe it's not even necessary, maybe you can look at it as a dynamical system that, enters in some kind of entrainment, so that you have basically, it behaves like a flock of birds, they all move together, and they seem to move together without any evidence that there is any signaling, or a school of fish, they move all together, like that. And so some dynamical property that needs to be looked at in some depth. So to me, those are the two.
Federico is, just to add to what you just said, pointing to the possibility of coherence outside of space and time. One perhaps way to proceed in this particular experiment, and think carefully, perhaps Henry can assist in this, or ask if we can assist in this, is to make sure that it is quantum coherence and not classical coherence, because you can also have classical coherence. And I can't quite see how it would be classical coherence, but, we should eliminate the possibility that this is the case.
Like catastrophe theory, there's a point where, something happens in a chaotic system. It happens instantaneously, but many particles before, were not behaving in that way, something like that.
Yeah. So if Stuart Hameroff were here, he would say it's a collapse onto microtubules, and then there's a coordinated collapse among microtubules and different neurons, but from a non-local.
Well, I'm saying that actually that would be an explanation just within conventional physics. That you don't have to even assume that consciousness has anything to do with it.
Right.
So that would be the road to explain that with conventional physics.
Yeah, that's what.
If that doesn't explain it, maybe
Right.
And if there were a mathematical theory of consciousness, then maybe that could explain.
We suspect that it does require quantum, but we're saying try to exhaust classical explanations first.
Yeah.
But I think that's important, though, that, it would seem logical to do is to really try to correlate those particular regions with any sort of conscious thoughts that are happening. I mean, when you map into the domain of conscious thoughts, are these two things that are related also connected to the things that happen together when a certain sort of thought appears? I mean, that would be quite interesting.
So an outside stimulus that's turning all these regions on simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So they experiment with these 4 couples who have been treated like particles in proximity to each other and then separated, after entrainment, and then they, are able to. You have one in, far away having an EEG, and the other one being with a circumcortical magnetic stimulation. I don't know if that study's been replicated, but it was highly regarded. It looked like it was a well-controlled experiment. Do you think quantum effects can occur across entire individuals like that, from a particle to a whole human being?
You mean outside the brain or just inside the brain?
Just to explain that experiment, just to explain how these folks were somehow connected. So that when you stimulate one's brain, the other one was somehow responding to it with the same EEG patterns and feeling certain emotions that didn't seem to be provoked otherwise.
I presume that since you're talking about it, that these experiments are something you really believe, because
I'm a scientist, so I, like you, and just intrigued until further confirmation.
All the skeptics say, well, there's something wrong with the experiment and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm glad that you will stand by this, right?
I'll stand by asking about it.
And I think, yes, we have to ask the right questions. And of course, also, we should not jump into answering, from a preconceived or ontological point of view. And I think Federico in his talk, and to a certain extent Henry too, mentioned the ontology that we seem to be operating under. And most scientists don't usually question the ontology. They don't question the way they're doing science, the epistemology. They don't question the foundations of their science, because it's just somehow would undermine what they're doing. Now, I think all of us believe here, if you don't speak up, but I think we all sort of believe that really it is more to science than just accepting a particular. In fact, science advances by questioning all the time and revising itself and bringing down the old theories. After all, no theory that was true 100 years ago or maybe 120 years ago is still valid to its full extent.
Let me just ask kind of a relevant question, and that is, I try in the theorizing that I do to only use data that appears in a published, reputable journal. And have you had any trouble? Have you published this? I mean, I know that people who do work like that often have trouble getting a reputable journal to publish it, and if there's not published, I feel uncomfortable in using it. Have you published this, and is there any trouble?
Well, it's not my study. This was a study that came out of a lab in Toronto. The principal investigators in Persinger. I think he published it. A lot of these studies come out in neuroquantology, which I guess is the best journal of those types of studies, which, yes, folks are very skeptical of them because they're out there. It's fringe science, but, I do pretty mainstream, science on Alzheimer's disease and genetics and cell biology, biochemistry. But there's always an interest in the fringe, because the fringe science, and even, I don't want to put them together, but even to some extent science fiction can kind of sometimes give you ideas for what's going to come next. It might intrigue, it might inspire you to do out-of-the-box experiments that you wouldn't normally think about doing. So I think it's worth reading them, and of course as a scientist you always want replication, you want confirmation. When your students go into the lab, We remind them that their goal is to disprove their favorite hypothesis, not prove it. That's what we do as scientists. We try to prove the null hypothesis. But I urge my students to read crazy stuff because you never know what's going to inspire you to do an experiment that might change the paradigm. And I don't know if that studies was replicated, but it was published in a peer-reviewed journal. I don't know who reviewed it, but as I don't know who reviewed the paper, but it was published in a peer-reviewed journal.
I have a question for Henry. Henry, how do you think the physics could explain qualia?
Explain what?
Qualia.
Well, qualia is, I kind of identify it with experience. And so the things that quantum theory is explaining is basically you have your thoughts. There are two languages that are involved here when you're doing research of this sort or thinking about these sort. There's the language of psychology and mental phenomena, which includes qualia, sensations, all of the things that you describe in the language of psychology. Now there's another language down here, which is the language that you describe in terms of mathematical properties ascribed to space-time points. And the problem is to understand the relationship between things described in these two very different languages. And certainly the core idea of quantum theory is to say that that because a physical theory, certainly quantum theory is based on these physical descriptions, and yet it says that the basic reality are the qualia. And so the whole theory is about unifying these two elements. And so when you ask, well, what is the theory about? It's exactly about those qualia and how they're related to the physically described part. So I would say that's the point of quantum theory, to say that in some sense these two things are almost, that the reality is fundamentally the qualia that you're talking about, and that's the fundamental thing, that's the fundamental reality, and that the physical description is kind of an adjunct part of the way that our qualia are related to one another. In other words, the quantum theory explains, or is supposed to explain, how your qualia have the structure that they do in fact have, and how it's related, in fact, to the physical description that's also part of quantum mechanics. And so I would say, yes, it's all about qualia. The whole theory is to explain the structure of your qualia. And that's the aim, the announced aim of quantum theory. When the founders of quantum theory invented the theory, that was their fundamental move, to say the theory is really about describing the structure of qualia and the structure of our experiences, which include, our sensations, feelings, and all those things. So that's certainly the announced aim of quantum theory, and that's what the theory is about.
Okay. Yeah, you're both discussing the importance of language. In fact, it was Niels Bohr who spent a lot of time, and sometimes people said, well, he doesn't make any sense. He himself admitted that, we're dealing here with a realm which is, now we say that it's the fundamental realm, where our language that we use in everyday language fails, and in fact, I would say maybe guides us perhaps in some, in some brain science way of understanding. It guides the way that we perceive reality. So the language is very, very important. I would like at this point to, unless you have any additional points, to open it up to our wonderful audience.
I just want to say one thing that didn't quite answer. I did say that there's the physical part, but the point is, and this is the main point, that the physical description, although it's described in terms of mathematical properties ascribed to space-time point, describes not a material universe. It describes this thing that's kind of in the realm of, it's in the mental realm because it's just potentialities for your experiences. So this thing that seems, and if you edge yourself into the classical way of thinking, it should be describing material stuff. It's not describing material stuff in quantum mechanics. It's describing potentialities for the experiences to be what they are. And so you're able to tie the physical into the mental.
I agree with you. Yeah.
Okay.
Great discussion, and thank you all very much. I'm a physician, researcher, and a physiology, pharmacology person. I think the discussion about entanglement and Rudy's description of neurologic activation activity brings up several important points. One of them is how precisely can we make measurements, and I think you commented on that as well. Let's not jump to quantum theory where classical theory or explanations are valid. Another issue, by the way, is a publication thing, since I'm a journal editor, but you all have probably more experience than I do with having journals reviewed or reviewing. Just because something is published, obviously, as you know, doesn't mean that it's valid. So I have a question about that, but I just want to make one very quick comment about the proximity of cells, tagging them, for example. It depends how far back you want to go. Obviously, all those mesenchymal neurons came from one fertilized egg. So it was all one cell, and then that cell obviously became 2, 4, et cetera, till it was trillions, and then they get pruned back in the case of the brain. So at what point do you want to tag them and label them? The one cell that became 2, they're obviously entangled very much at that point. At what point do they become disentangled, if ever? And so I think this is one of those questions. It depends on where you put the bookmark as to how you can answer it. But
can you say the same thing about the Big Bang?
Exactly. So it all goes back to that one cell or that non-cell or whatever it is. The question I want to ask, and this has to do with the discrimination of what gets published and what doesn't get published, and this was an interesting discussion by Dr. Radin the other day about the 2-slit photon attention-intention experiments.
Yes.
Is this?
Yes.
Yes. Am I making myself clear?
No.
So, is that widely believed to be a real phenomenon where people at a distance can have an influence by observing?
It's not widely believed, and
So it's published.
I think that was Dean's point. That so even though it gets published in referee literature, or sometimes it meets a lot of resistance, it still does not change the paradigm, so to speak, because science actually is also collective system of I wouldn't say belief system, but certainly a collective way of endeavor or interacting with the universe. So it is an issue. Einstein himself, the general theory of relativity, the only reason it got accepted so fast was because of Sir Arthur Eddington, who was a very famous physicist at the time, believed in it and made sure that he will get out in the public arena. Otherwise, general theory of relativity may not have been accepted so easily.
Can I ask you, quantum experts, how skeptical you are of this particular work? The photon influence of the observer nearby or at a distance?
I was actually close to those experiments because my foundation actually supported some of the work of Dean. And frankly, the signals are way above the noise, and so it's hard to argue. There is nobody there, so there is no physical influence that you can see, and the phenomenon is there. And so now, how to explain it, of course, we don't know. But and that's really, this whole field needs a theory, needs a mathematical theory. Otherwise, we will not make inroads, and because people want a mathematical description. And so,
didn't the meta-analysis show highly significant p-values for that? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
He's saying that.
so
I mean,
yeah.
Phi Sigma. Phi Sigma, Higgs boson was put into the Hall of Fame of particles because it had Phi Sigma results. So, I mean, the same result.
But he's saying that we don't have the mathematical
But
theory.
without a theory, as people say, well, you must have done something wrong. And that's it. I don't want to look at it because my view of the world negates the existence of such a phenomenon.
Sometimes
There you go.
significance and replication
End of
precede
case. End
explanation.
of case.
Yeah.
Or it does not get replicated.
Yeah, so you're not going to win. You're not going to win with more experiments of the same
Let's
thing.
move on to other questions.
Well, I have some
Oh, you-
comment.
Okay.
Well, I have some personal experience. Well, a lot of personal experience because I've actually talked to people, and you talk to them, and they seem like very reasonable people that are seriously interested in doing good science and making what appears, from my perspective, to be. Now, in fact, I was delighted, therefore, to have some experiments that I could look at and analyze because they appeared in a very mainstream journal in psychology. Do you know the experiments by Darrell J. Bem?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, there are a series of experiments that it turns out that you can explain by saying that all of them, by saying that nature's choice is not random. That the experiments seem to indicate that nature's choice is somehow biased towards accentuating the positive values of the observer. So that's quite interesting, It says nature is somehow on our side, and this was huge statistics, 9 different experiments, all showing the same thing, published in the Journal of something in social psychology, and Darrell J. Bem is a very senior researcher at Cornell University, and so I felt now I have something I can use and talk about and respect, and so the experiment was designed so that other people, he wanted replications, and in fact 80 different replications came in over the course of a year, and so he looked at he and 3 other, one including a very respected statistician from the University of San Diego, looked at it, and they wrote a follow-up paper, and the paper reported very positive, I don't remember now exactly the numbers, but hugely positive, supportive, and this is by a number of respected co-workers. It wasn't just Darrell J. Bem himself. And so he has tried twice to get it published in a respectable journal, and so far 2 of them have turned him down, and so there's a huge resistance by these journals to publish anything that might reflect upon their somehow, and so I mean that's a problem that makes it difficult to have data that you can.
Well, his first publication actually was in a mainstream journal, very respected, but maybe because of the reaction, then the further journals, publications attempted have met more resistance, which is very interesting.
We have
Let's move on.
another
Let's move on.
question here. Actually, Julie has something to say about that. I'm sure.
Okay. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say 2 things. One is, sure. In fact, I was one of the reviewers on that Persinger paper. On the Persinger paper, you said you didn't know I was one of the reviewers, and I can tell you that, at least from my point of view in neuroscience and someone who does EEG, I couldn't find anything wrong with the methods. I didn't quite buy into his interpretation, but what you're really reporting are the methods. So I think it's solid, but I also think when you said it hasn't been replicated, actually it was a replication of previous studies. Yeah. So, for instance, Jerry Wackerman had this checkerboard study published in a mainstream journal, very well done, very well controlled, showing the same kind of effect. So we flash a checkerboard in one EEG booth, in a distant EEG booth, you have a response. And then there's this guy, Mike Atkinson at University of Washington in Seattle. He's done the same thing several times with an effect that seems to depend on the relationship between the couples. So I think based on those data, this is something that, although most scientists don't buy into it because of the inherent biases, it's pretty solid.
Yeah. Federico, you want to say something?
I was just saying that I actually spoke to Daryl Bem and asked him what was the reaction of your colleagues at the university. He said they completely ignore his work.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here.
Hi, I wanted to just offer a possible kind of entanglement theoretic look at one of Rudy's questions, which was about memory, and suggest that if you view the brain as a quantum system, and if you believe that quantum theory applies to everything, then it applies to the brain, and you reject, at least as a possibility, reject the idea that there really is an objective collapse, so that if you reject the idea that there's objective classicality, then I think one would say that classical information isn't stored anywhere. So our memories don't consist of classical information being stored anywhere. So just by way of analogy, think of the memories stored on your computer, and then zoom down in scale to whatever scale you want to be at, where you think it really is quantum mechanical, no kidding, so go down to femtometer scale or something, and look around for any classical bits. And at that scale, there are no classical bits at all. The computer is rather a dynamic physical system that recreates classical information on demand and recreates classical information in a way that's determined by its physical structure. So I would at least suggest the possibility that the same thing is happening in the brain, that there's no classical information stored in the brain at all, that the brain is a system that creates classical information on demand. So in Henry's language, your attempt to remember something is asking nature a question, and your brain as a system is nature answering the question with classical information that's created right then, not retrieved from some storehouse somewhere.
Okay, any questions? Questions?
It's a good statement.
This is to Dr. Tanzi, and the question is that were you aware in this very conference there was a thing presented by John Hagelin on a possible solution to entanglement, and that was this higher dimension string or wormhole that would connect two particles. So if you're aware of that, that could be extensible to a collection of particles, which is a neuron. Perhaps, are you aware of that? So that's, I think the published paper is by Moldachina and Susskind a couple of years ago.
So,
the solution.
yeah, so I mean, it's obviously not my area, but, what we would have to do is figure out how to test all that in a world that still believes in a material universe. So, I mean, I know many of us here don't, but, to publish in high peer-reviewed journals, you still have to measure and give a material construct for what's going on. And to me, I just don't even know if we know how to ask the right questions yet to address such an intriguing hypothesis. I think I think the next several years will be actually for neuroscience is figuring out what questions to ask, and then thinking, okay, now what technology do we need to measure? Because in science, people still insist you measure and you quantitate. And, if we go back to the statement you made earlier, if qualia are all in the quantum realm and we're just measuring and observing in the classical realm, how do you bridge that scientifically in the lab with experiments? I mean, someday we will. I just don't know. I just think it's going to take a while to figure that out. Right. But we have to start thinking about it now. It's meetings like this and this type of gathering that says, at least let's start thinking about it.
So thank you for approaching the unapproachable. to go in the directions of asking the right questions, what I feel is a more simplified explanation of what we're talking about here is saying that we're trying to measure locally something that's non-local. We're trying to measure something linear that's non-linear. And so far, it looks like we're looking to measure things in the brain because that's all we have and that's our place of measurement. And it seems that if instead of assuming a thought would appear in the brain, we could say it appears in the field and then collapses as a wave into the brain. If there was a way to measure the field, that seems to be the precursor of measurement. And so then I thought to myself, how could one measure the field if you would have to measure the field in time? But of course, if the events aren't happening in time, it's an ever-expanding measurement. So I'm just wondering...
Yeah, measurements require space and time.
Exactly.
So kind of a quandary.
I guess my question would be like, can we move towards measuring the field in some way before we measure the brain?
You want to take this one?
That's yours.
That's mine?
Yes.
Well, it's a big challenge. Anybody wants to comment on that? Well, first of all, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the field? Because just saying the field, what is the field? And I think from what Henry was saying and what Federico was saying, it's very specifically tied to mental or consciousness field. And then, of course, we try to define as much as we can, but remembering that language itself, mathematics for sure, cannot ultimately describe consciousness. So it's a tough thing. And the new science that I think we're advocating is the science of qualia. I think that's what also Henry said, right? That's what Federico said. It's the science of qualia, and that's a tough thing. But we're not giving up.
Henry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can I just ask, when you say the field, what field are you talking about? I mean, for example, if you're talking about the electromagnetic field, of course, that's the field that all of our measurements are really measuring. I mean, they're measuring the electromagnetic field, so that's the thing we are measuring. Or are you talking about some other more mysterious sort of field?
I was including the electromagnetic field not as something separate from human beings, but as an inclusive beyond just the human mind and human brain.
Outside the brain?
Not as though there isn't an inside and outside, but...
This is mine. And
I don't want to imply that the field is outside and therefore exclusive of human consciousness. I was just suggesting that our measurements take a step beyond the human brain because that's not maybe the initial source of impulse. So the field, including the electromagnetic potential, but everything, including the human, being that we can never step out of the field. We are always in it.
Right. We have... let's give one more person
We have
a chance.
one question over here.
Thank you. Maybe I'm limited, but for me it's qualia, something I can't describe, like color, red, green, and blue, and so on. And now we have quantum qualia. I don't know.
Okay. So maybe one more question. This was a short one.
Okay. Let's see.
Be kind to...
Great.
And I will invite anybody else to please come up and talk to us afterwards. Yes, please.
I have a question about language.
Language.
The language that we are using now to discuss, that is a subject-verb-object language, and does that complicate our dialogue?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, understanding is infinite and explanation is finite.
Yeah.
And bottom line is we're using laryngeal grunt sounds to explain the infinite, and that's a problem. It always is.
So they do not participate in subject-verb-object and cause and effect. And would that sort of semantic approach change how we look at science and change our ability to perceive a paradigm? I guess I'm asking a question about the relationship between those grunts that we make, how we interpret them, and what we perceive, and how we use those to define what we perceive.
Yeah, I mean, I think we get back to the statement about red, right? I mean, red's a qualia that we can't explain. It's perceived. But we can give you the frequency of the wavelength that provides red. We create red, but we can measure a frequency of light that produces red for us. Red is a species-specific qualia or event.
Right.
And a bacterium has a universe that's just as valid, but it's not going to see red. So, I mean, all of these things, qualia and the entire universe are species-specific. And if you go within species and differentiation, they're really human, person-specific or individual-specific universes. So there is a multiverse already. There's one right in here. Yes.
Okay, we have run out of time officially.